This story is fascinating. It's rare, good journalism from CNN. So there's been a giant uptick of fraud as a direct result of the coronavirus. Watch, and they give a bunch of examples.
While coronavirus was overwhelming hospitals, governors across the country were in a mad scramble to find supplies, and a lot of people were making a lot of money.
I can't tell you how many orders we placed with vendors who were acting basically as brokers, who just started businesses in the middle of this pandemic because they saw an opportunity.
From New York to California to Louisiana, hundreds of millions of dollars in ventilators, masks, and other personal protective equipment were ordered, but some of it never showed up. After stalled deals, the governors of both California and Maryland say they're looking into deals with Blue Flame Medical, a pop-up medical supply company started by two Republican operatives.
Unfortunately, across the country, there have been some cases of fraud. It is unconscionable that anyone would try to exploit this pandemic for profit or for personal gain.
An attorney speaking on behalf of Blue Flame told CNN the company fully intends to honor the contract for 1.5 million masks and 110 ventilators to Maryland, and says that the Chinese government interfered with its ability to fulfill the shipment. In Louisiana, at the height of New Orleans' pandemic crisis, $7 million of PPE supplies never showed. The third-party supplier now being charged with defrauding the VA. Former federal prosecutor Ellie Honig says a crisis with billions of dollars being spent quickly is the perfect environment for wide-scale fraud.
Anytime there's opportunity, anytime there's a pot of money, dishonest people will have their hands in it. Even in times of emergency, for some people, there's just no bottom.
Adding to the issue, the lack of federal leadership on supplies that force states to fend for themselves, scouring the internet or relying upon unknown suppliers. Case in point, New York State.
Competition among states, there were competition among private entities to get this equipment. The federal government was trying to buy it.
The one that's received the most attention is a deal for 1,400 ventilators from a Silicon Valley engineer. The state paid $69 million, but the ventilators never arrived. A spokesman from Governor Cuomo's office said HHS referred us directly, confirming they were vetted and approved by the federal government themselves. The engineer behind the failed deal did not return CNN's calls, and though most of the money has been returned, $10 million is still under negotiation.
As a nation, we can't go through this again.
To fight fraud and better their bargaining position, New York and 6 other Northeast states have now joined together to stabilize the supply chain and combat the fraud that is also spreading like the virus itself.
In an ideal world, you would have had the federal government stepping up earlier. That's not happening, so governors are getting it done.
The fact is, the federal government and a group of volunteers organized by Jared Kushner were behind the referral for that failed New York ventilator deal. That's according to the New York Times. So it's not just about getting federal help, it's about getting experienced federal help. The states say that's not happening, so they are going alone.
Yeah, I mean, it's a crisis, and in a crisis, you have fraudsters that pop up, scam artists, crisis profiteers. I mean, that's what this is, and you see it for every crisis. Remember, I don't know if you guys have ever seen the documentary Iraq for Sale, The War Profiteers. I believe that's the name of it. And they describe how these private contractors, they would sell the government these cans of Coke for soldiers at our bases in the Middle East. And they would charge them over $20 per can because the taxpayer was paying and there was no accountability. And in that instance, that's even a little bit different because even though they're price gouging, at least the product's actually there. In this case, we're talking about legit hey, let me sell you whatever it is, ventilators, masks, whatever it might be, and then they just don't show up. What? And it's also, listen, I'm sure there are many instances of deals that were made where it was a legit company and they tried to fulfill it, but they couldn't. I'm sure there were just some instances of, we overestimated how much we would be able to deliver on this stuff. I'm sure there's some instances of that. But yeah, there are plenty of other instances of just outright fraud and scam artists. And they're just cashing in because they see whenever they sense the desperation and how much people need help, they're like, oh, I'll pounce, act like I have, what they need, and then I don't. So it's really crazy. And honestly, what this shows is this is a case for good government, and it's a case against free market fundamentalism. Because when you have the government is desperate, they're in need, instead of them leaping into action early on, as soon as we learned about this pandemic, and firsthand they had the ability to do this stuff. But instead of that, because that requires more work and more effort, they just lazily were like, okay, let me contract with private businesses that supposedly already do this. And it's like, well, some of them turned out to be totally fraudulent. And you got now, didn't you? So this is, market fundamentalism. This is something that happens when you deal with a system like that. And we'll cover a story later, but Trump and the federal government had the ability to make millions of N95 masks early on, and they said no. So this segment really is an argument for like good governance. You should have had way more ventilators. You should have stockpiled those. You should have stockpiled the N95 masks. You should have done production on your own. And but they didn't. They're contracting with all these small companies, and it's much harder for the state to like properly vet this stuff because the states usually don't have the ability to do everything that the federal government has the ability to do. So I don't know how easy it would have been for the state to like mass produce their own N95 masks or ventilators. It might be near impossible, whereas the federal government does have that ability, and they just didn't do it. So, I guess you had, in the case of Andrew Cuomo in New York, he had the state start making its own sanitizer, but they used prison labor for it, which is slavery. So they used slavery to make hand sanitizer. Anyway, I digress from that. Point is, you're going to have fraudsters pop up, scam artists, crisis profiteers, unless you have systems of government set up to handle these crises in the first place. And unfortunately, when you have people in charge who don't believe in good government, you have people running the government who are market fundamentalists, then it's like, okay, well, now you reap what you sow, and the chickens come home to roost, and some other saying that you all know, fill in the blank. That's what happens, and it's sad, and it's depressing, and unfortunately, it was predictable as well, but in the heat of the moment when everybody needed help, they just acted first and thought about it later.